Okay, now let's talk about hierarchies. So if I were to create a cube, and if I were to duplicate it, let's turn on wireframe on shaded. So select it and Control D to duplicate. So let's call this one the parent. Let's call this one the child. Okay, so in order to put something in a hierarchical relationship, so I would select the child first, shift select parent, and hit P. So now if I select the parent, the child now follows it around. And if you expand with a little plus sign, it's going to expand this out. And so this is now a hierarchical relationship. So I could Control D and duplicate this child again. And so child and child 1 are now both children of this parent. Now what I could also do, and they're going to follow the parent around whatever it does, and it's almost as if the pivot point for the children here is the parent. Now they can also move independently. So I can take this one here, do that one there, so they can move independently of each other, but they still follow the parent. So if you were keyframing, any moves that these did are only in relation to the parent. And that'll become more apparent as to why that's significant down the road in rigging. But I wanted you to be aware of it. Now, here we can see that both children are at the same level. So we could also take this child 1 and we could shift select the first child and hit P. And so now if we use the shift key and expand here, we can now see that this child is a child of that one, and this one is a child of the parent. So this would be a hierarchical relationship. And often in rigging, you will need to be very aware of how that works. And this is why I've got the select hierarchy button. So one click on the top node and it selects all of them. That's particularly useful when you have joint chains. So that is hierarchies. So now a word about constraints. So constraint is similar to parent, except it doesn't put it in a hierarchy. Okay, so previously would select the child first, then the parent, hit P. Then if I want to undo that, I can hit Shift P. You can also take, in the outliner, you can take the cylinder and middle mouse drag it, put it over the cube. So it's now a child of the cube. You can also select it in the outliner, middle mouse drag, and pull it out of the hierarchy. Okay, but parenting starts with the child. Now when you constraint, or do constraints, it starts with, I guess you could say, the parent or the constrainer. And the constrainee is selected second. And to this day, after having done this thousands of times, sometimes I forget the order. But anyway, select the constrainer, the constrainee, and so I'm going to make a point constraint. So let's go ahead and add that to my shelf. I'm also going to add orient and parent. Now there are other constraints such as pull, vector, aim, scale, some more advanced ones. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're just going to keep it to parent, point, and orient. Okay, so if I click on point, now I have the option box on so I can come here and choose. Reset the settings, so the default is maintain offset off. So if I point constrain this to that without the offset, this is what happens. It then sucks the other object and just attaches it to the other one. Okay, and if I expand the cylinder, we can see now it has something under it. So the cylinder has this point constraint on it, and you can see it here. And to delete it, I just select it and hit delete. So if I grab the cube and move it, you can see that the cylinder is point constrained to it. So let's take this, let's just hit Z a couple of times. So that undid the constraint, put the cylinder back. So now let's do it again, but this time with maintain offset checked. So we'll click on apply. So now when I grab the cube and I move it, the cylinder is constrained to it with the offset. When something is constrained or is driven by something else, it'll typically turn up magenta. So we're constrained with translation, but not by rotation. And so in order to constrain the rotation, we would need to come in, select these again, do an orient constraint. Let's keep the offset checked, apply. So now if I move the cube or rotate it, you can see that the cylinder is constrained to it both in translation and orientation. Now note that this is not like parenting where this became the pivot point of that. Okay, so let's go back and delete these two constraints. So let's go back this time, shift select, and let's do a parent constraint. Let's reset the settings, leave maintain offset on, apply. Okay, so now with a parent constraint, if I rotate, it's going to work just like parenting did. Or if I move, where this is like the pivot point. So you might ask yourself, well, why not always just do a parent constraint instead of a point and an orient, or even parenting itself? There's reasons why you'd want the control, finite control of each of these methods. Comes into more advanced rigging. So let's delete that. And now, just to show you, we can also come into constraints. Let's go to point again. This time, let's only constrain the y-axis. So let's apply or add. And so if I move the cube in X or Z or rotate it, nothing happens. But if I move it in Y, the cylinder is constrained in the Y. So a lot of power and precise control with point, orient, and parent constraints, and you can restrict them to certain axes. Constraints are very important in rigging. So there you have constraints.